Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Jeb Sprague joins us today, and we talk about how regime change projects seem to be on overdrive right now, with a key role played by the Organization of American States in regime change operations in Latin America and Caribbean states, former colonial states. Recently, in the Commonwealth of Dominica, an island country in the West Indies, there was a successful resistance to regime change. In Bolivia, there was a strong resistance as well, but the coup was still successful. Jeb's research and reporting on the role of Bolivia's top police and military brass in planning and executing the coup shows that it was a long-term project, with training at the School of the Americas. Dr. Jeb Sprague is currently a research associate at the University of California at Riverside. He formerly taught at the University of Virginia and the University of California at Santa Barbara. He's a founding member of the Network for Critical Studies of Global Capitalism, NCSGC. He's taught in the Caribbean and East Asia and North America. He's the author of 2 books, Globalizing the Caribbean, Political Economy, Social Change, and the Transnational Capitalist Class. That was in 2019. And his other book, Paramilitarism and the Assault on Democracy in Haiti, 2012. We recorded this on December 6th, 2019. Jeb Sprague is here talking to us from California. Hi, Jeb. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hi, Joanne. Thanks so much for having me.
So it's great to talk with you again. And as Jeb and I were talking earlier this week, deciding how we wanted to shape this interview, because I had said to him that, it seems like we are in a regime change overdrive. The empire's really, really rolling. I don't quite know why, whether it's just the Trump administration just sort of hitting their stride, or whether the people around him are fearing that he's not going to be around much longer and the next president won't let them overthrow a bunch of governments. I don't know what is driving it, but there's also a particular focus, and we seem to be back in the Reagan years where we're focused on the Latin American countries again, which is disturbing. But Jeb is an expert on the Caribbean states, and he also just wrote an article at the Gray Zone about some of the details on the coup in Bolivia. So we thought we'd talk about that, talk about the OAS, which is behind a lot of this. But how about if we start out, Jeb, by talking about the OAS and what it is and what they're all about, because I don't know that much about this organization.
Okay, yeah, we can think about it, the OAS and these supranational forums and organizations. We can think about them in the context of what's happening now with capitalist globalization. So really far from being motivated to make the economic development of any single country as its priority, really what we see right now under capitalist globalization is that the logic of the system, the logic of capital, is to enrich individuals, a handful of individuals and private institutions, really at the expense of nature, at the expense of exploited people, the marginalized, the negatively racialized and gendered working people around the world. And so alongside this form of production that we have, this global capitalism through which we all are producing our existence, alongside that, we have these different powerful entities. And the most powerful of those is the United States, the country that you and I live in, right? That really is the most powerful empire in the history of our species. So operating then through powerful states, through these different apparatuses, exercising what we might call an effective sovereignty. They act out internationally and globally through the sovereign power that they've built up. And so U.S. officials then, they utilize diplomacy, different commercial mechanisms, political, military, and other means to really shape the contours of global governance in pursuit of their so-called quote unquote national security goals. So we really see then how powerful states, institutions, supranational organizations, right, that have developed in the post-World War II period, take such a key role in this uneven development across the planet, and really shaping it and influencing it. And as you talk about in your podcast, there's such this long history of U.S. intervention, either through soft power or through, more traditional, forms of warfare. And now we have these advanced hybrid forms of warfare. And so the Organization of American States, this institution is based in Washington, D.C., just down from the White House. And it's the Cubans call it really the Office of Yankee Colonial Affairs.
Oh my gosh.
and so it's really then been used over the decades, very much alongside U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. It's over 60% financed by the U.S. government, and the history of it is important. Back in the the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, a key historical juncture in the Western Hemisphere, a key moment. And Cuba is kicked out of the OAS in the early 1960s. And moving forward, the OAS operates alongside U.S. policymakers and promoting anti-insurgency. Like in Grenada in 1983, the OAS and its Caribbean partners take a key role with the U.S. in invading Grenada there in the Caribbean. The OAS in 2010, in the first round of the presidential elections in Haiti, is basically intervenes to remove René Préval, who was a neoliberal politician in Haiti, but was also anti-Duvalierist. So he politically had been shaped during the struggle against the Duvalier dictatorship. And the OAS, after the earthquake in 2010, they worked alongside U.S. officials who did not want Préval to have his candidate we know this through WikiLeaks, who did not want his candidate to come into office because he was cutting deals with Venezuela to get resources. And so the OAS intervened. Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR, in Washington, D.C., has an excellent paper that Mark Weisbrot, an economist in D.C., wrote on this, where he talks about that the OAS intervened to basically keep two right-wing candidates, a neo-Duvalierist, Michel Martelly, and alongside evangelical woman, to really be the two candidates in that presidential runoff. And then, as we know, Michel Martelly, who was so connected with Duvaliers, neo-Duvaliers in the country, became the president. And since then, his handpicked protege, Jovenel Moïse, is in office now, and one of the most unpopular presidents in the region.
Being really protested, right?
Yeah, really suffering from a legitimacy crisis. And he's done everything to rebuild the military that has traditionally been used as a form of internal repression in Haiti. So the OAS really got that ball rolling post-earthquake in 2010. The OAS has also played a key role in working alongside the U.S. in isolating Venezuela, right, which is one of the most brutal economic wars in living memory in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
I don't think it's reached the level yet of the hybrid war on Iran, but it's getting there quickly. Um, and so you see, so that history of the OAS is very important, and we can talk about it in
Now,
regards to
can
Bolivia
I
and
just ask you?
Dominica.
I'm sorry, I was interrupting you.
Oh,
Can I?
I was just saying we can talk about the OAS in regards to Bolivia and Dominica, those most recent examples.
Let me just ask you one more thing about the OAS. I assume each country has a representative that is their representative to the OAS. Are they appointed by, is it a political appointment by the current president or prime minister?
Exactly. The heads of state, their governments appoint their officials to the OAS.
But like NATO, for example, I know this isn't a military alliance, it's a soft power or a diplomatic alliance of sorts. Um, because the United States is the majority funder for the OAS, does it also dictate what goes on, or because
Well, I mean, the OAS has a lot of influence, but the thing is, there's a lot of conservative and neoliberal states across the region that work very closely with Washington, and small states that are very easily pressured, right? The
right,
United States puts a lot of money into USAID, influencing elections across the region. But there's also just, there's countries with social bases and groups of people and elites that align with Washington's policies and the fractions of global capital aligned with Washington across the region. So there's a long history to that, but the OAS is connected to a lot of other like treaties and institutions and groups that act out across the region. They do a lot of the vote monitoring that we can that is so heavily criticized now because they've clearly intervened to create electoral crises in countries that Washington would like to see regime changes in. There's this long history of that. And there's the IACHR, Human Rights Inter-American Human Rights Group, that is connected with the OAS, and uh, and so of course, a lot of institutions and NGOs. It's based in DC, so there's that whole
yeah.
beehive of organizations there that work and they have a big influence on the media as well.
One more thing, the in the situation with Venezuela and the attempt to trigger a coup there, there was a different organization that I think it was begun by Chrystia Freeland in Canada, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was something like an OAS, but it was a different set of countries that seemed to be driving a lot of that. Were they?
You're talking about the Lima group.
Yes, that is it.
So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of different groupings of countries um, like that exist, and that's basically a lot of U.S. aligned countries across the region, and they work closely with like European powers and the United States. So yeah, there's even like a military alliance. Colombia is more and more being integrated with NATO. Uh,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of different institutions and bodies. There's CARICOM. There's long histories to this. So for example, CARICOM, that grouping of Caribbean countries, which is really to create sort of like economic like integration in the
Hmm.
region, and is more sort of business oriented. Initially, like during the struggle against colonialism, and that in that post war in the 1930s and the 40s and 50s, there were a lot of radical movements and militant labor, and major huge philosophers, right, like Franz Fanon and all these big thinkers that came out of the Caribbean region. The Caribbean was the first area colonized by Western Europe. So it's had like this 500-year experience as part of with colonial capitalism and international capitalism and now globalization. So people there have a real strong memory and understanding of imperialism and capitalism and slavery. And so, earlier in the 20th century, there were attempts, for example, by like Jamaica, Guyana, and Trinidad, which are have big mineral deposits and petroleum in Trinidad, and bauxite in Guyana and Jamaica. They had attempts to create like a federation where they would pool their resources and be able to operate together, and they'd be stronger. And there were also militant labor unions in different parts of the Caribbean. And if we look back at the history, Washington and London worked really hard. Churchill actually, did a coup against the president in Guyana. The United States, all across the Caribbean, it has its hands in all of these political, attacks throughout the 20th century. So the Caribbean that we see today, it's not like it's ahistorical. It came out of all of these struggles and then counter actions by these great powers to try to mold the situation.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I haven't been to any of these places, by the way, except for the Bahamas, which I guess technically is not a Caribbean state. I know some things about them, but have you traveled to a lot of these places? Just curious.
Yeah, I had to when I was doing my research, and I have friends and all sorts of connections, and going back and forth to different countries across the region, and for academic conferences and research and things. But
Good choice of a thing to specialize in, Jeb. They're really beautiful little places. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is, rarely getting to spend time on the beaches and things, because doing, interviews and on death squads in Haiti or in home communities in the Dominican Republic. So it's it's a fascinating region with its history and the changes occurring over recent decades and how it's fitting into current events. It's I think real important to look at, and I think there's a lot that our academics that study the Caribbean. There's really the last few generations of academics to do the Caribbean. The focus is really kind of on what we call cultural studies or like literary critique. But there are some people that study political economy and that sort of thing, and so it's an important area of the world to understand, and it's so close to the United States.
Right. It's got to be complicated to be a tiny nation. A lot of them have, fought for independence, break out of colonialism, at least, to some extent. It's got to be really tricky to be the leader of a small nation like that in the shadow of the United States, and then sort of torn between some of the countries like Venezuela, like Cuba. You got to be a really smart person to navigate that position, I would think.
Well, that could lead us. I think that's a perfect segue into talking about
Perfect.
Dominica.
Good.
So Dominica, for those who have been watching on the news or Twitter, Dominica has really been in the sights of the head of the OAS, the General Secretary Amalgaro, and for regime change, for trying to amp up a crisis in the country. And so this country, Dominica, it's spelled like Dominica, but the O after the D is pronounced with an A, so it's Dominica, Dominicans.
Oh, Dominica, and not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, different place. Yeah.
Exactly. And so Dominica is an island. It's only 290 square miles. Its population is about 76,000 people. About 70,000 of those are voting age. And it's one of the only places left in the region where there's a sizable indigenous community of the original indigenous people that lived in the Caribbean, who were basically completely wiped out through colonial violence and the diseases that the Europeans brought into the region. And so there's about 3,000 people left in the indigenous tribe that live there on the island. They're called the Kalinago. So the island, and it's part of this Eastern Caribbean chain of islands. If you think in your head, it's not too far away from St. Kitts or Barbados or these islands there. And it was initially a French colony, and so the population there are Catholic. The French were there in the late 17th century, and then in the 7-Year War, and the French lost the island to the British in 1763. And so for a little over 200 years, the island was held by the British. And the vast majority of the population are the descendants of enslaved Africans, negatively racialized people, right, under world capitalism, the way that it spread out across the planet, and negatively racialized people with West African, Sub-Saharan African with phenotypical features from that part of the world. And so when slavery ends in the region in the 1830s and in those following decades, this is a very small island and a much smaller population than today. So most of the small handful of white plantation colonialists left the island. Only a few stayed behind, and a population of some part, a small part of the population who were ethnically mixed, had mixed backgrounds, turned into part of that population turned into this sort of like emergent bourgeoisie on the island. And the island, it gained its independence in 1978. There's a diaspora where a number of people, tens of thousands of people, migrated in the 1970s and the 80s. The country suffers from like a lot of brain drain. So if people, become highly skilled or educated, it would be hard to find a job there because it's such a small island. The island's primarily made up of volcanic rock, so it has very beautiful. It's very, I should advertise for people to go there now. It's very beautiful for scuba diving and snorkeling. But tourism, it's actually been one of the islands with the least amount of tourism. They do have cruise ships, usually a couple times a month. But it's been very, very difficult for the island. So just to give like a full, just very quick, it's thinking about its modern history. The island really, after colonialism, went through a little bit of a rough patch. So in 1981, there was an attempt. It's called the Bayou of Pigs. And it was an attempt by this motley group of white supremacists, of Nazi, KKK, neo-Confederates from the United States and Canada, where they actually attempted to go to Dominica and take over the island. And they were going to run it. It's fascinating to go back and read the court records. They were going to run it as like a place to ship cocaine, and the apartheid government in South Africa was going to invest. And it was this whole like insane white supremacist plot called the Bayou of Pigs. And they were planning to use it as a base to launch an attack on Grenada, which was this leftist project in the South Caribbean. That coup actually fails. The United States government does not rubber stamp it. Was too crazy. And so throughout the 80s and the mid 90s, there is this sort of like classical liberal, somewhat conservative president in the country. And she is very closely aligned with Reagan. She benefits from a lot of U.S. programs in the region in the 1980s. And she takes a key role when Reagan invades Grenada, and they look for some fig leaf support in the region. So then really moving forward then into the 1990s, the European Union is formed. And so Britain cuts off a lot of its they had spent money in the region to help agriculture and to buy a lot of agricultural products. But when the UK joins the European Union, they have to cut a lot of those subsidies and help for the region. And so
Were they part of the
Dominica,
Commonwealth? I'm sorry, were they still part of the Commonwealth or
they
some
had a lot.
tie?
They no longer had the Queen as their sort of like official sovereign. They had removed that, but they had some different connections
Yeah.
remaining with the UK. And so once the European Union started to form and they lost a lot of that help in the mid 90s, the country really faced trouble because they were primarily making money off those agricultural exports of like coffee and bananas and things like that. And so they really then were searching in the late 90s and in the 2000s how to survive in this whirlpool of a global economy. And so they've tried a lot of different things, like, for example, like exporting scrap metal, buying small machine parts, importing, and then selling them at a higher price. Kind of these low levels of tourism, trying to get cruise ships, remittances from the diaspora, and then they have the small amount of agriculture, and then better fishing off of the island. And then the really interesting thing that has developed in recent years is not only cryptocurrency, but also what they call CBI, which is citizenship by investment, or what we could call commodified citizenship, where they actually sell citizenship, and they're one of the cheaper places where wealthy people around the world can you can actually buy a passport and citizenship. Like the prime minister of the country, Roosevelt Scarrett, he's really been masterful at this. And it actually it started before he was prime minister. It started in the 90s. But since he took office, he's gotten a lot of wealthy people from the Persian Gulf and China to buy citizenship, because there's like over 120 countries then you can travel to with that Dominica passport. And so the interesting thing is there's been then a lot of kind of like moralistic critique of this, that like, how dare they sell citizenship to these wealthy people, et cetera, et cetera. There was just like an Al Jazeera documentary making this kind of moralistic critique of Dominica. But the interesting thing is, if you look at it from their perspective, I mean, the country is in desperate straits. It's so hard to get money that you can use to import products, right? They don't have an industrial base. There's all these structural dependencies that the country has. And furthermore, to make matters worse, in 2017, they were hit by Hurricane Maria.
Oh,
Hurricane Maria had 165 mile per hour winds. It was a Category 5, and it hit Dominica directly on. It apparently tore the roofs off of something like 90% of the buildings. It trashed the dozens of medical clinics. It is total about over $1 billion in damage. 65 people dead. And so it really wrecked the country, massive destruction to homes and buildings. So this is a country in a desperate situation. They did have a university called Ross University, that a medical school that was there for about 40 years, but it left after the hurricane. So the country faces a lot of problems, and maybe next we could talk some about the political scene and the OAS in Venezuela with Dominica.
yeah, yeah, let's do that. Now, do you want to talk about the recent election and the attempts? Do we have enough time to do that, or do you want to do that in a different
Yeah, we
interview?
can. Yeah, maybe just focus on Dominica right now, so we wrap
Yeah,
this up.
yeah, yeah. That's a good idea. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
I've got a little more time. I'm not sure what you have going on, but if you
yeah.
want to talk about the recent events there, I think those are really important. But this is great, though. Really interesting.
So this guy Roosevelt Scarrett, who becomes their prime minister in 2004, He had gotten degrees in the United States and had moved back home, and he was teaching. They have a kind of like a community college on the island, and then they have a satellite of University of West Indies, which is a university based in Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados, and they have a small satellite there in Dominica. And so he became a Ministry of Education, and then two prime ministers in a row actually died of natural causes. And so then he was made the prime minister. And since then, he's really done a masterful job at building up Dominica, really finding all these different ways to bring in investment and social infrastructure, really improving the lives of the working poor in the country, building up its healthcare infrastructure. Actually, if you live abroad and you want to come back to vote, the government will actually pay for your plane ticket to fly back to vote. So a lot of amazing developments while he's been in office, and so he just today, actually, we're speaking on December 6, 2019, he was elected to his fourth term in office. So kind of like this key historical juncture in the country's history, sort of like an FDR figure, if you could say that, for this tiny, small island, right? FDR also was elected to a fourth term in the United States, although he died before he could serve that fourth term out. But so interesting individual, and Dominica allied. The interesting thing is that they allied with the Latin American and Caribbean left, with, for example, the Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the government in Antigua and Barbuda. They've worked closely with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Bolivia, while at the same time dropping their recognition of Taiwan and switching to China. And so China invested a lot of money in Dominica and building up its road system, its infrastructure, investing in different infrastructure in the country. And people from the outside can look critically at this, but for Dominicans, it really greatly improved the standard of living and their situation on this island. And furthermore, because of people know that history, people are to the left in a lot of parts in the Caribbean, and especially in Dominica when it comes to like economics, politics, understanding an internationalist history of the world. At the same time, though, it is very socially conservative. It's not easy for people that are homosexual, lesbian, gay, transgender. It's socially conservative country. And
is that because of
in regards to patriarchy?
Is it the Catholic religion that the influence of the Catholic religion, or it's just their culture?
I think it's all numerous different factors and historical dynamics in the region and in the country. It's been very, intense, for example, very intense anti-communist propaganda throughout the 20th century. The important role of organized religion as a mechanism for social control in the history of the Caribbean, how this, affects family life and et cetera, et cetera. So, the interesting thing, though, is that this tiny, tiny island has broken with the diktat of Washington. And so when we take that up to the present day, where Venezuela is under such a brutal hybrid war and is really, drenched in all these problems with large-scale migration, people leaving the country, and a lot of economic chaos with the hybrid war is really the central factor behind. And with Cuba and Nicaragua, right, under intensive economic attack as well. Dominica, in these small islands like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they've kept by they've stayed firm in maintaining policies of non-intervention and recognizing international law. I interviewed, for example, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines back in May, and he was criticizing Trump for invading, using the Secret Service to take over the Venezuelan embassy in DC, like we talked about in our previous
Yeah.
interview, and violating the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations. So what's happened then is Roosevelt Scarrett, the prime minister, has also criticized the general secretary of the OAS. He's criticized him for his intervention in Bolivia and Nicaragua and here in Dominica, and really helping constructing this electoral crisis in narrative in Bolivia, which we know now through the CEPR studies and other analytical statistical analyses that have been done. We know now that Morales won that election legitimately, and so he's openly criticized that, and so he did not let the OAS come in for this recent election, even though Almagro was asking to come in. He on Twitter, Almagro and different statements he put out, claiming that there was going to be chaos, that the elections were rigged, et cetera, without any evidence for any of this. It was very clearly he was siding with U.S. foreign policy and, undermining allies of Venezuela and Cuba in the region. And so Dominica has a vote in the UN. It has a vote in the OAS. It's clearly not an economic powerhouse. It's not a strategic concern of the United States, but it has those votes. And so Dominica refused to recognize Juan Guaido when Trump tried to carry out this coup in Venezuela and get the OAS behind him. Dominica doesn't vote alongside the U.S. And so they want to get rid of governments like that. They don't want a resurgence like we see in Mexico of the left. They don't want that happening. So there's this party, the United Workers Party in Dominica, which is basically it's the more sort of neoliberal party, the UWP, the United Workers Party, led by a guy named Lennox Linton, who really worked alongside the OAS to try to delegitimize today's election, calling for the population to block the streets, trying to get the election suspended through the Supreme Court, et cetera. But those ended up failing. There's different constitutional and regional mechanisms in the Eastern Caribbean and on the island that, things are run like clockwork and politically in that part of the world. And this sort of haphazard attempt they made at really creating this influence operation has really failed. The OAS has failed in Dominica. So today the election was held. It was a success, large lines, they said some of the largest turnout of an election in many years. And Roosevelt Scarrett and his party, the DLP, the Dominican Labor Party, has won overwhelmingly. Wow. And I just checked that before this talk.
So, and I assume, well, first of all, they were sort of ready for the OAS to try to pull something off like they did in Bolivia. So he blocked them from having any influence on observation of the elections or the vote count or anything like that. And also, I assume that Roosevelt didn't have any term limit issue that could be exploited either, right? So that he didn't have complications like that.
Exactly. Yeah. They did have CARICOM, Commonwealth, UN, and Carter Center. Were all invited to observe, so there were a number of observer missions there. But yeah, the OAS was just they weren't allowed to get their hooks into the country, and but it's amazing because we see them trying to pull this off just on the heels of what happened in Bolivia.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing. This brazen bulldozing of trying to meddle in elections, trying to overthrow governments, just boom, boom, one after the other, or even simultaneously. It's really kind of dizzying to watch all this happen. But, here's this tiny country, really in dire straits. They've got to do all kinds of things to survive. and to improve life for their people. But this guy has the guts to stand up to it. I mean, that's really something, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Wow.
Maybe maybe we could talk a little bit about Bolivia real quickly if we have 10 more minutes.
Yeah, I would love to do that because that in the interview that I did with Ben, we mentioned
With Ben
that we're
Norton.
going to, yes, Ben Norton, and we didn't even touch on that topic that you had written about the details that you dug up are really important, and we actually didn't go into that in the interview with Ben because I knew I'd be talking with you. So yeah, let's switch over to Bolivia, which, by the way, I just saw something on Twitter today that said that the the opposition party in Bolivia that has taken control, they're calling on Israel for help, and they're claiming that they're turning everything upside down. They're saying that the leftist parties are, um, you know, murderous and authoritarian, and they're calling for help from Israel. I mean, it just makes you. It leaves me kind of speechless, to be honest. But yeah, let's go into the information that you reported in the gray zone about. I guess it'd be about 2 weeks ago now.
So, yes, you've been doing some excellent interviews and great interview with Ben. And again, Bolivia is a country with a lot of structural dependencies, and it has this long colonial history. It's gone through this integrative process into the global economy. We've seen the rise of an indigenous middle class and a major improvement in the quality of life under Evo Morales, big investments in infrastructure, bringing indigenous people into the political process, social investment, improving the conditions for the working poor across the country, and taking these sovereign policy internationally, working with the Latin American left, attempting to get more public assets and resources to put back into poor communities in the country, and promoting things like tougher environmental regulations on a global level, and not siding with U.S. regime change policy and across the region. So Bolivia in the center of Latin America is an important country, and as Ben and others have written about, right, as part of this broader sort of counterattack across the hemisphere, Bolivia has been targeted, and I think in a much more organized and coherent way than what we just talked about with this small island Dominica. Bolivia is much more important, with large lithium, which this is a large, vibrant society, bordering, right, all these other countries: Peru, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina. So it's a strategic country. And at the gray zone, there was that other article looking at the rise of a right-wing fascist movement in the country. What my article looked at was the role of the top military and security brass in the
Right.
coup. And so a lot of people, when they looked at this coup, they were talking about like it was a completely internal domestic squabble. And this was like the immediate reaction, even by a lot of critical academics. And I knew from my research on Haiti, there has to be something deeper here. Looking at WikiLeaks, the State Department cables that I always would read on, the military security people in Haiti and their communications with the U.S. Embassy. So I was curious about that. So I started to dig into that. And I found how looking over the military guys, there was audio recordings in Spanish and Bolivian media where there were a number of coup plotters, ex-colonels, Bolivian colonels, who were talking about their connections with Bolsonaro, Uribe, Duque, and the president of Colombia, and to Narco Rubio, and to different right-wing neoconservative American politicians like Bob Menendez and what's the guy in Texas? The worst. What's his name?
Oh, Ted Cruz.
Yeah, Ted Cruz. It's almost I just like feel sick saying his name,
Yeah.
but yeah, they had connections to all these people, and they talk about one of the coup plotters talks about his connections throughout the Bolivian military, and through listening to this interview, it was possible to identify the names of the people that were speaking because they would like introduce themselves or introduce other individuals, and so I look then at those guys' names alongside these two online databases of the School of the Americas Watch,
Yeah.
which is an organization, an activist, anti-war, led by religious leaders, right? Different progressive nuns and reverends and priests that have traditionally headed up this group, and a lot of activists in the United States. And that group basically holds accountable this school called School of the Americas. They changed their name now to the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation or something like that, WINSEC. And they hold those people accountable. The Department of Defense that runs that base, where they have this long history of training Latin American officers that have been involved in so many massacres and
Yeah.
raids, coups. And so through that database, I could see that there were 6 individuals, including not just those guys on the call, but another guy they were talking about, and also the head of Bolivia's military, that at one time they had trained at the SOA, at the School of the Americas. So they all had U.S. military training, and through this phone call, it's clear they were communicating with right-wing U.S. politicians. In addition to that, the other really shocking thing was, so I started researching the head of the police inside the country, who was really a key guy, this guy named Williams Kaliman. Oh, whoops, sorry, no, that's Williams Kaliman was the head of the military. The head of the police is a guy named Calderon Mariscal. That's his last name, and he was really key because before the military coup on November 10th, when the military asked for the head of state, when they suggested he resign, I mean, people have tried to say that's not a coup if he asked, but I mean,
Yeah.
what happened if the head of the Pentagon asked for, suggested that Trump resign? I mean, that would never happen, right?
Well,
So,
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I don't
so
think anybody, fell for
you
that
wouldn't
one.
take that seriously. So that something like that would ever happen here. It never happens under U.S. allied governments that the head of the military suggests the president
Yeah.
resign. I mean, this only happens in countries targeted by the U.S., right?
Yeah.
So, so I looked at the head of the police. Who was this guy, Calderon Mariscal? And just through very not a lot of search, I found that in 2018 he had been the president of this group named APALA and was spending a lot of time with it in Washington, D.C., where APALA is based out of the Embassy of Mexico in Washington, D.C., under the former pro-U.S. Mexican president, Calderon. And in Washington, D.C., this group APALA, it's like an organization that brings together police chiefs all across about 10 or 11 countries in Latin America, all very pro-U.S. countries, except for Bolivia. That was the one country that was sort of an odd duck in this organization. And I researched it. I said, who is this group APALA? And so I searched for them. Their website no longer existed. They wouldn't answer their phone calls or emails. So I turned to the Wayback Machine, right? You might have heard of that. It's this
Oh, yeah.
website where it takes snapshots like daily of every website on the internet. And so you can look at old pages that no longer exist.
And it's more
And so I
important than
looked,
ever right now.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I looked at the Apala website and I found that basically what they do is they work closely, like on a day-to-day basis with U.S. federal agencies and primarily with the FBI. And so there's all these photos and information on their websites that have been taken down of these different guys working with the FBI, with ICE, with the DEA. And he was the head of that. And so in the article, you can see it. One of the photos of many different photos I found of this guy, it shows him at the FBI training academy that's like 36 miles out of Washington, D.C. And, he's buddy with all these different U.S. top officials. And so then the last, I think, interesting thing about the article is I go back and look at the book Inside the Company by Philip Agee. the CIA whistleblower who published this amazing tell-all book in
Yeah.
1975. And he really had his life destroyed by the CIA. I mean, they did everything to ruin his reputation and just make his life difficult for him during the last decades of his life. And in the book, if you read the book, it's a fascinating book inside the company. He talks about how the CIA uses other U.S. agencies, institutions like USAID, like the FBI, because CIA officials, they can't just like walk up to somebody or meet somebody and like openly, pump them for information or begin slowly trying to recruit them. They have to do it through other agencies or other front organizations.
Here
And
on U.S.
so,
soil, you mean?
yeah, exactly, or
Yeah.
even abroad too. So I talk about this in the piece where there's all these ingredients that we can see of the U.S. This was a coordinated long-term project, and they've worked one by one, right, to take down the different pink tide. I never really liked that term, but the
Yeah,
different
me
pink
either.
tide, yeah, the different pink tide states across the region.
Yeah, that that's the thing that I mean that was really great work that you did. But it also I have to admit I wondered why Evo allowed all of that to happen, assuming that he knew exactly what was happening. I don't know, maybe he thought maybe these guys had, dual purpose for the training that they were given, or it just seemed like didn't he have enough power to to stop that kind of coordination? I don't quite understand.
I
Uh,
think I think that's I've had a lot of people ask me that question actually, or a similar type of question, and people talking about that on Twitter and social media. And I think uh, for me, it was very useful in thinking about it in regards to Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti, who was overthrown in this coup in 2004, with a lot of similar types of things. A country with so many structural dependencies, so much pressure, with a media that vast majority of the media is very hostile, right? Big business interests and a lot of money. And at different points, the Bolivian government did take stands like blocking USAID money from getting to different, through these democracy promotion programs. At different attempts, at different times, there were attempts to try to offset some of that intervention. But I think at the end of the day, the Bolivian state, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's in a world system and global capitalism and this interstate system with a global empire. I remember when I was writing my book on Haiti, I found a cable where it was talking about this guy who was like a very close personal friend of Aristide, and the cable was talking about him at the U.S. embassy, talking with U.S. officials and giving him inside scoops on what Aristide was thinking. And I showed this cable to a close Haitian friend that knew kind of all the players behind the scenes, and he was just like shocked, like his mouth dropped. He was so shocked by reading this cable because he said, "Wow, this is like one of Aristide's best like friends that he tells everything to, and this
mm,
guy is meeting with U.S. officials." So just the amount of resources. I mean, they can give visas, money, status. You can get jobs, right? There are all these different gatekeepers that are out there. So it's just it's a very difficult situation for a political project like that to reproduce itself in power. But I think there's definitely legitimate critiques of AVO and that project. But I think at the same point we have to recognize the great achievements that were made.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I have even before this happened, I have a lot of respect for him for a number of reasons. But I mean, anyone who lifts that many people out of poverty and empowers an entire indigenous population. I mean, how can you not respect that person and admire what they've done? And Bolivia is an important country, but it's also been such an extremely poor country, and Evo came up as a farmer, although he had a lot of political experience. But it's not easy to figure out these this Leviathan, and all these different intricate relationships between different organizations and different institutions. So, he can't figure everything out. And he's also got to rely on people for information. And if they are being trained in ultimately a hostile country, perhaps they were being trained to deceive him too, to make him think that there was no problem. They were loyal to him, and they were, maybe he thought they were his best friends too. We don't know.
Well, they could have been. I mean, these people could have been, content and been, loyalists for a while, or could have tried to, keep friends in different camps, or try to stay, keep their head down. I mean, there's a variety of different, personality types, and all these sorts of things are studied, and pressure can be built up. There's definitely opposition in Bolivia doing protests. People can be sanctioned. There's media campaign, and then if you have these friendship networks, like I was looking at the social media accounts of other people in Apala, these police chiefs, and some of them are very conservative, and these are people that were like close with this guy. So I mean, there's a number of different ways. I mean, they'll even do things like through, relationships, and target people, and, bribery, and all sorts of things. I don't think it's been confirmed yet, but there was an Argentinian newspaper, I believe, that has reported that, or at least they're claiming that Calderon Mariscal has gotten a visa to the United States and $1 million payoff from the embassy.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that confirmed yet, but it would completely not surprise me. So I think we'll see what develops in these coming months with this election. And right now we're really seeing this repression in the country, the massacre in El Alto, another massacre in Cochabamba. I think it was November 17th and November 19th. And, really this attempt to restructure the country politically and wipe out Evo Morales' political party. And I think that it just reminds me so much of 2004 and 2005 in Haiti, where they had so many strategies to demonize Aristide and his political party, Famille Lavalas. And then actually when the guy's driven out of office, they do all these things to split that party, buy off opportunists or people who just don't want, to be murdered. I mean, some of these people, you can't blame them for, trying to, pacify the situation. These are people with families, and, this is a very complex social struggle. So we see all of that playing out. But I think again, like I said in the last podcast, I think your podcast is so important for helping us get at all these internal workings of how all of this plays out.
Well, people like you, and all of my guests who are so generous with their time and their knowledge, that's really important. And it's constantly amazes me that you're all willing to do it. And I'm so grateful for that, Jeb. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Joanne.
Please tell everybody where to find your work, how to support your work, and all of that.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, Jeb Sprague. That's JEBSPRAGUE. So Twitter, Jeb Sprague. I also have a blog, jebsprague.blogspot.com. I have a few books, Paramilitarism and the Assault on Democracy in Haiti. And then that's 2012 with Monthly Review. And then my new book this summer called Globalizing the Caribbean, Political Economy, Social Change, and the Transnational Capitalist Class, which is published with the Temple University Press.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that one. I'm going to get you on for at least one interview on that one after I read it. But again, thank you so much. And I'll be calling you again. And, thanks for doing all this work. And if I don't talk to you before then, have a great time over the holidays, and hope to talk to you again soon.
You too. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Jeb Sprague. Follow Jeb on Twitter at Jeb Sprague, Sprague. Find his writing at the Gray Zone, Mint Press News, The Canary, and at his website, jebsprague.blogspot.com. The Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support's really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find this podcast in many places, lots of ways to listen to it, any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening on YouTube right now, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.